Hello, I'm Tina Evans Keynes, and this is CITV Today. And today we're going to discuss the United States stop list and what it means to Bermuda residents traveling to the United States. Now, the stop list may pose a problem for some Bermudians who wish to travel, but very few people really understand how it works. So joining me today to discuss this topic in the CITV studio are United States Consul General Bob Settje and the Minister of Community and Cultural Development, the Honorable R. Wayne Scott, JPMP. Want to make sure I got the initials in, Minister. Very good, very good. And thank you, Mr. Settje. It's good to have you here.
Oh, thank you, Tina.
Well.
It's very nice to be here. Thank you.
Good. We have the word, as soon as you say stop list, in Bermuda, and I'm sure, how long have you been in Bermuda now?
I've been here almost 6 months. At the end of the month, it'll be 6 months.
Exactly. So I'm sure you've heard the terminology and the discussion as well.
Yes, more than once.
Yeah. And I know, Minister, as Minister of Culture, you also, I'm sure, in community, get a lot of queries about the stop list as well.
Yes, absolutely. It's something that depending on who you talk to, they have a different explanation of what it actually means. But there's a lot of misinformation out there. So from a community perspective, I think it would be great to get that information out to the public.
Good, because there was a lot of talk about it. Tell me, does the United States maintain? Is it true? Does the United States maintain a stop list?
Well, the way I like to explain it, I know that the term stop list has been in vogue here in Bermuda for several years. But I like to explain it as being more of a delay list than a stop list. The reality is that most people who want to travel to the United States from Bermuda do have the opportunity to travel. Now, sometimes they have to wait a while. Sometimes they have to go through a special clearance process. But the vast majority of Bermudians who want to visit the United States do ultimately get to go. So that's why I prefer to call it a delay list than a stop list. But we can use that terminology, certainly.
Okay. How does one get on the stop list? And we'll talk about what delay list.
Sure.
And how does we've heard that the United States, the Department of Homeland Security actually looks through the Royal Gazette and gets all the police records. Is that how someone's name ends up on the stop list?
Not exactly.
Okay.
In part, I suppose it can happen that way. Maybe the way I should explain this is by giving you just a little bit of context. Okay. As we all know, Bermudians, generally speaking, can travel to the United States with simply a passport. They don't need a visa or anything of that sort. But Bermudians are subject to U.S. immigration law like anyone from outside the United States, anyone who's not a citizen or resident of the United States. And U.S. law governs whether someone will end up on the so-called stop list. It's part of our Immigration and Nationality Act. And there are actually 10 different categories one might fall into that would make one inadmissible to the United States. And if that is the case, then certain special processing, which we can talk about, has to come into play. Now, the category most common to Bermuda, the one that Bermudians would most likely find themselves to fall into, and it's, believe me, it's a very small percentage of Bermudians. I don't want to try to indicate it's a lot of Bermudians, would be that having to do a category that has to do with crime and drugs. And usually it's for a conviction of a crime, a conviction of a drug-related crime, or evidence indicating that a person might be involved in drug trafficking. Those are the most common. Now, that brings me around to your question. How does one find oneself on the list? We may get that information from anywhere. If at the airport an officer in our Customs and Border Protection unit asks a passenger, "Have you ever been arrested?" Bermudians very often will answer, "Yes, I have." They're quite honest. And then the officer will inquire further and sometimes may say, "Oh, I'm sorry, you need special processing, go to the consulate." We may see someone's name in the paper, not that we have anybody devoted to sitting down and
Right.
culling the newspapers every day for someone's name. But if someone's name appears in the paper, if someone is convicted of a serious crime, we very well may keep that information and enter it in our system. So information can come to us from any number of ways. One thing I want to assure you, though, is that we do not have a direct line to the Bermuda Police Service. They don't provide us with anybody's criminal records or anything like that.
Okay, okay.
Well, certainly
Yes.
that white elephant in the room, if you will, is you hear this story so often. Someone gets caught with a joint 30 years ago, and they're stuck on the island. Is there any way for them to get off? Because you could argue that if someone, when they were 16 years old, got arrested for having a joint, and they're now 50, and that's not part of their lifestyle, certainly that's extraordinarily punitive.
Is that something that you've heard over
Absolutely.
similar stories?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I hear that a lot. I hear that someone who got caught with a joint 25, 30 years ago can't travel to the United States. And I'm here to tell you that if that is the only problem that person has ever had, that's just not true. All right? I know it's part of what you hear around town. It's what people will say to me. But it's simply not true. Now, what that person may need to do is undergo this special processing I talked about, which means obtaining a visa and a waiver of that inadmissibility. So, for example, if one were caught 25 years ago with a joint of marijuana, was convicted of possession of marijuana, that person is now on the so-called stop list. To get around that person needs to come into the consulate and apply for a waiver, a visa and then a waiver of the inadmissibility. And most of the time they're going to be successful. As I've mentioned to Minister Scott in the past and to others, I recently asked our consul in our consular section to look at our statistics. What we discovered is that over the past year, he has recommended that an applicant be given a waiver in about 94% of the cases that come before him. When he recommends a waiver, the office in the United States, the Admissibility Review Office, which is part of our Customs and Border Protection, grants a waiver in 98% of the cases. So your chances are very, very good of receiving a waiver if you apply. Now, going back to the case, the standard case of the person with possession of marijuana years ago, one of my jobs as the Consul General is to review my consul's visa decisions. I review a random sampling every week. I'm required to do so by law. By the way, I don't have the authority to overcome his decisions, but I have to be sure he's applying the law and policy consistently. So I have the opportunity to see these cases. And never have I seen a case where he has denied someone who had a single drug conviction 25 years ago. In fact, most of the cases I see in which there are waivers involve far more serious crimes, crimes that might surprise you, things like homicide, sexual assault, robberies, drug trafficking, possession of large amounts of drugs, some very serious crimes. But even in cases like that, people who've done something years ago but have demonstrated that they since are on the straight and narrow, have turned their lives around, can receive waivers, and it happens quite frequently.
Yeah, good. That's good to know. Now, tell me this. I want to talk about the application process,
Yes.
and then I also, Minister, want to talk about in terms of young people. What does this mean? But what's the application process for a waiver?
Great. Well, the first thing I'm going to throw out there is our website.
Okay, good.
Because we have a tab that tells all about how to apply for a waiver, and that is hamilton.usconsulate.gov/NIV waiver program. Anyone who's interested in applying for a waiver can go to that website and can get all the information. In fact, from that website, one can make an appointment to come in and apply for the visa and the waiver. We have all of the instructions there. I should mention that We are so concerned about this at the consulate, we actually set aside one morning every week to process waiver cases. And so people come in, they use the website to find out what they need to do, what information they need to gather, how to apply, and then they come in on that
Does it require
particular
an
day.
interview?
It does require an interview with our consul.
Okay.
It normally requires that they bring in their police records to show what the situation is. Again, we don't get that from the police, but we need to ask the individual to get police and court records. We make a determination as to whether they are in fact inadmissible under our law. If not, it's not a problem. But if they are, then we can go forward with the waiver process.
Yeah. So the responsibility, the onus is really on, although we say it's a stop list, the responsibility becomes on the person to go and seek out the solution, which is to apply for a waiver.
Yes, and that does appear to be the case. But some of the, a few more of the frustrations that I hear out there is that someone who has, for the last 20 years, had waivers. In some cases, a waiver that lasted for 10 years. All of a sudden being told that they can't travel, and a process which takes a long time to actually to get a new waiver, and in some cases that was only a year or two. But from my understanding, there was a change in the process. And is that the case?
Yeah, that's correct. There has been a change in the process. In the past, waiver processing tended to be a pretty quick process, and waivers were quite often granted for up to 10 years, meaning you'd get a waiver this year in 2013. You wouldn't need another one until 2023, and for those 10 years you could travel, no problem. But post 9/11, a few years ago, the changes didn't happen right after September 11, 2001. They were incremental. It changed over the course of a few years. Part of it was that that Customs and Border Protection was being more cautious. So they reduced for a period of time the maximum length of the waiver from 10 years down to 3 years. And in fact, actually we're giving a large number of one-year waivers, even to people who'd had longer waivers in the past. So again, reduction from 10 to maximum 3, giving 1. That's begun to change, though, recently. Just this past fall, in, I believe, November of 2012, the policy changed. They can now give up to a 5-year waiver. So we're hopeful that will change. So there was that aspect of it. Now, as you might imagine, if someone has a 10-year waiver, you only have to see them once every 10 years. But if they have a 1-year waiver, you got to see them every year. That adds to workload.
Absolutely.
Well, that created more demand for waivers. At the same time, the office in Washington that was responsible for reviewing the waivers and giving the approval had a turnover, bringing in new blood, and they had to get used to processing waivers. The end result of all this was a backlog in processing. So a few years ago, if you were Bermudian and needed a waiver, it took a week or two. Now it takes 5 to 6 months. And that can be a problem for some people. Our advice in those cases is apply early.
Definitely apply early.
Yeah.
And that, again, the responsibility. You were just talking about the interview process.
Yes.
Is it a difficult interview process? Would it hinder someone from coming in? Is it very punitive? That's what I want to talk.
I don't think it's punitive.
Okay.
Our consular section chief, our consul Adam Vogelzang, is a very polite, capable young man.
Okay.
By all accounts, he treats people very well. I hear only good things about him and his staff. So no, it's not like that at all. I mean, he may have to ask some hard questions, but he will do it in a courteous and respectful way. And if he doesn't, then I need to know about it. But I don't think that'll be a problem.
Okay.
And so I guess one of the questions that typically come up is, can the government of Bermuda do anything to help those folk historically who have had issues?
Historically, probably not. The determination as to whether one has had a conviction is based on U.S. immigration law, the definition of conviction there. So that people who've had something in the past, let's say that that the conviction was, I think the term we use in the States is expunged. You might have a different term here, but it's the same idea. It goes away. Nonetheless, under U.S. immigration law, we'd still treat that as a conviction. So now going forward, if you were to change the law, say something is a crime now, but in the future no longer is a crime, well, that would change things. But for people who've had that situation in the past, no, there's really not anything.
But that brings up something else very interesting. So the whole concept of expungement or basically concealing a record is irrelevant for U.S. immigration law policy. And I guess the statute of limitations that is irrelevant as well. I mean, or, you don't want to encourage people to not tell the truth, but if someone did have a minor offense 20 years ago, is that still a valid charge? Is there any statute of limitations from immigration?
No, from our immigration law standpoint, no, there's no statute of limitations. We actually, the statute refers to them as permanent ineligibilities.
Okay.
Yeah. So, which goes back to the whole point of the responsibility then just becomes on
It
the
does
person.
become on the person.
But you don't want to get to the airport and
Right.
the questions asked, you answer, or someone says, I know of you being convicted,
Right.
or the information is there. So it's the responsibility does go on the person to go and seek out the waiver for the. Now, even if they have a certificate of rehabilitation, I read somewhere in my notes, sometimes even a Bermuda government certificate of rehabilitation does not necessarily mean that you'll be entered into the United States.
That's correct, because the way, and we've reviewed the certificate of rehabilitation with our legal experts back in Washington, looking at it through the lens of U.S. immigration law, and it's still treated as a conviction for U.S. immigration law. So even though you have the certificate here, and I think it's certainly a wonderful and legitimate thing here, we're still going to treat that as a conviction for purposes of our immigration law.
Well, and that brings up another question. So, of course, expungement doesn't exist from U.S. immigration policy. What about non-adjudication? Or if someone is sentenced to, okay, well, if you do community service, or again, in the case of someone getting caught with that joint, if you go to a drug treatment program, you won't actually be charged. So how does U.S. immigration law define a conviction?
Well, that's a really good question. And I'm going to tell you initially, it's a little bit complicated. And I don't want to get too lawyerly on anybody, because then we'll lose the entire audience, right? But generally speaking, a conviction is under immigration laws. Anytime you have an adjudication and a penalty, or a confession and a penalty, that kind of thing, then you're going to have a conviction. That's generally speaking. There are some twists and turns in all of this. So if you were to do something without an adjudication, pre-adjudication, if you do X, we'll never charge you with a crime, that probably is not going to be a conviction for U.S. immigration law purposes. But if you are if you admit what you've done, you're sentenced to complete this and it goes away, well, you've got the confession, the adjudication, and the sentence, so that would be a conviction.
Okay, so even if someone goes to court and they're told that if they complete 10 days of community service, or they complete a 30-day program, and that the charge would be dismissed or wiped away, from a U.S. immigration policy perspective, that's still a conviction, because you had a penalty. You had to actually go do something in order for that to go away.
Well, it's the two steps. There had to be a judgment of some sort and the conviction. Again, if a judge or a prosecutor were to say, we're not going to charge you at all, we're not going to go forward with this case as long as you do X, Y, and Z. If you do X, Y, and Z, it's never going to be a conviction. But if it's formally charged and it's disposed of formally, even if it goes away later, most of the time we'll treat it as a conviction.
That's interesting. So then I think I also read in the notes that someone like Nelson Mandela would have had to apply for a waiver because of his conviction and something like that. So,
Well, now that's a different situation.
Okay.
There are people who, in the past, because of their political activities,
Okay.
found themselves ineligible to come to the United States, inadmissible to the United States. Nelson Mandela at one time, I believe, would have fallen into one of those categories. Some of the leaders in the Middle East in the past certainly would have fallen into that category. Fidel Castro in Cuba, he's been to New York, but he could come on a special visa because of his status as a head of state. There are people who can get around, get around is not the right word.
Right.
There are exceptions for them in the immigration law, but that's a slightly different position. They're in a different position. They're not getting waivers. It's because of the position they later find themselves in that they're allowed to go to the United States without being hindered in any way.
The waivers last for how long? What sort of a period, the visa and the waiver, are you allowed to remain in the United States?
In terms of how long you can remain in the United States, that is up to Customs and Border Protection at the time you seek entry into the United States. The general rule is that someone entering with a Bermuda, as you know, Bermudians, generally speaking, are admitted for up to 6 months. If you have a visa, a general standard type of tourist or business visa, they can admit you for up to a year, although generally speaking, they don't go beyond 6 months unless there's a good reason to do so.
Absolutely. Minister, the stop list requiring waivers, the whole concept of not being able to travel speaks to a larger issue in our country, and that is the amount of people that are affected by it because of either a drug offense or some other serious criminal offense.
Right.
What would you say to I know you've probably with all your constituents and people that you're meeting, what do you say to the younger folks that, that could be faced with this, and those that have been
Right.
faced
Well,
with it?
let me answer your question like this, because these are conversations that I've had with my children. Is that be careful what you do, because your actions could have very significant consequences. And in the case of young people getting caught up in Bermuda, this is a very small, isolated island, and to be stuck on this island is extraordinarily punitive. So, first of all, don't get in trouble.
Right.
But if you are, don't continue to be in trouble. And it's clear that there are provisions by which you can still travel. And the only other thing I'd like to ask is, you talked about, of course we're talking about this one issue, but there are, from my understanding, approximately 10 different categories of ineligibility.
That's correct.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, and we're really only talking about one of those that relates to crimes, but they run the gamut from health issues, prior immigration violations. We still have one on the books for draft dodgers from the Vietnam years, those sorts of things. Yeah.
Wow.
I wanted to mention one thing I think is important, I don't want to forget. What people will ask sometimes is, oh my goodness, I find myself on this stop list, but I need to travel immediately. I have a medical emergency, or my family member has a medical emergency. What do I do? Then you get in touch with us right away, and we can seek an expedited waiver. We can do that. We don't do it in every case because, as you know, if you ask for special treatment in every case, you lose your credibility, and it's not going to happen. But if anyone has a true emergency, really needs to go to the United States, they should contact us right away. And if we feel it's appropriate, if our consul feels it appropriate, he can seek expedited treatment. And we have been able to get same-day waivers in some cases. So I think that's worth knowing.
Well, and those emergency waivers, are they typically for just health reasons, or could it be business travel or other type of family emergencies, school?
Yes, it could be more than we tend to think of a medical emergency, and that's the best case, not the best case for everyone involved, but certainly the best case you can make for getting a waiver quickly. But we have certainly done it in cases where people need to attend a business conference, in cases where people need to get back to school, that kind of thing. Certainly we've done it in those types of cases.
And again, you can find the information. Your website is actually real good.
Yeah.
It's a pretty good website.
I think it's the best part of our website, actually.
You can get the information right on the website,
Yeah.
and we'll make sure that we put it up as well. What then would you say to folks that are in this position, that find themselves not sure of whether or not they had a conviction years ago? Do I get this? Should I get it? You know, what would your suggestion be?
I would recommend it. If you think you need a waiver, then go to our website, take steps to apply for a visa and a waiver, and come in and get it all straightened out. Once you've got it straightened out, assuming you don't have any problems in the future, that should be the end of it. It should be fine for you. For those folks who have had prior waivers, know they need waivers, and know they're going to want to travel, check your current visa, see when it expires, and if you're getting into that 5 or 6 month period, come in and apply for a new visa and waiver. You get to keep your passport with the old visa and waiver while we're waiting, and you can still travel, but look ahead and make sure you get this out of the way so that you don't get to the end and you can't travel and you don't have an emergency and there you're stuck.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you said which is key, is that Bermuda's waiver requests, visa waiver requests, they go right to Washington along with everybody else.
That's exactly
so,
right.
You know, it's not just a special, we do it here on the island.
Oh, no.
These
Worldwide.
move from Bermuda to Washington. The decision comes from Washington back to Bermuda.
Right.
So it's important that the timing
That's right.
is right. So people, if you're thinking of traveling, you want to have you need a waiver, then you absolutely should get in there
Yes.
early.
Right, and I was just going to say, so for the young person looking to go to school who has run afoul of the law, is it a year or two? Is it 6 months where they can demonstrate that they're on a different path before they could seriously be considered for a waiver? Is there any set time?
There's no set time. That is a very good question. You know, say a person's 18, 19 years old, they get into a little bit of trouble. Now, if they come in and apply for a waiver right away, well, their chances are not going to be as good as if something has happened a year or two in the past. I'm not saying they won't get a waiver, but I'm saying that as someone who's demonstrated after having made a mistake that they are on the straight and narrow is in a much better position than someone else. And that's true, as I said before. I've seen very, very serious crimes, but if we're talking things that happened 25, 30 years ago and one hasn't had a problem since, even those folks can get waivers.
Well, we're getting ready to wrap it up. Minister, I know this is an issue that
Yes.
you will continue to help people with and try to give as much information. Anything you want to say in closing?
Well, I would just say, again, to those young people, would just advise them to stay out of trouble, and because bad decisions can have a lifetime of consequences. And of course, from what I'm hearing, you know, if someone does need a waiver, apply 6, 7 months out. Don't get frustrated with the process. It's something that everyone has to do. It's not just us. And go to that website, hamilton.usconsulate.gov.
Yeah.
Yes.
We'll make sure that goes up on the screen. Good information for anyone out there. I hope that we've cleared up to a certain degree that the stop list is.
I hope so too.
It's a delayed list. You can get a waiver, but you've got to go through the process.
And I want to say, we want Bermudians to come to the United States.
Yeah.
You know, we have this, Bermuda and the United States have had a long, wonderful relationship.
Right.
So we want Bermudians to come.
Right, and that's all the time we have today. But I want to thank you, Minister R. Wayne Scott,
Thank you.
for bringing the issue to us and keeping it in the forefront. And we certainly, now you're going to get everybody calling you for the send them to the website.
It happens now, and I will, because again, it's
Absolutely.
getting the right information out there makes all the difference in the
Yeah,
world.
and U.S. Consul General Bob Settje, thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you,
I'm
Tina.
Tina Evans-Keynes, and this is CITV Today.